Studies, did their trials, were they geared to test whether the vaccine prevented transmission?
No, they were not.
Did the FDA production ever say that the manufacturer was permitted to say that it reduces spread?
No, that was not part of the FDA review or the fact sheet.
A new director was being sought, and your hat was in the ring, but unfortunately, you got passed over for it, and you left after that. That's the reason why you...
No, that's not true. There was no hat and there was no search. Dr. Gruber and I resigned on essentially the same day.
The reinfection rate among my people that were seropositive was basically zero.
Means when you express benefits that clearly don't exist, that are easily disproven, that causes vaccine hesitancy. When you say over and over it can stop transmission, when the actual studies show it doesn't.
There is no doubt that a previous episode of COVID induces immunity that is protective.
So it's not some conspiracy?
No, it's not a conspiracy.
Our governor shut down churches on Easter but left the strip clubs open. I don't think there was any science behind that decision. There may be other things driving it, but it certainly wasn't science. As we know, vaccine injuries were already being reported in 2021, including instances of myocarditis in healthy young people. Doctors Gruber and Krause were aware of the reports, but wanted more time to evaluate the data. Dr. Marks asked them to move the BLA completion up 3 weeks, which would be in line with Biden's expected mandates. Doctors Gruber and Krause explained that moving the approval date up would mean cutting corners and lowering standards. But Dr. Marks told Acting Commissioner Woodcock that he had Operation Warp Speed to live up to. They then removed Dr. Gruber and Dr. Krause from the licensing application review, the top 2 experts at the FDA, taken off of the job because they wouldn't do what the politics wanted them to do. After the FDA rushed the licensing process and began promoting boosters and expanded the vaccine authorization to include children, Doctors Gruber and Krause expressed their concern in a Lancet Medical Journal article about the boosters. Pfizer released a video encouraging people to get their vaccine because it works against then-recent Omicron variant, despite not having the data to back it up. Take a look. We play the video.
You know that unwelcome guest everyone wishes would just leave already? That's COVID-19. That's why I got the new updated booster, designed to help protect against recent Omicron variants. Got it?
We'll talk about this video later. There were some things missing there at the end. Soon after, the FDA and Dr. Marks created 41 videos to assure the public that the vaccines were safe. In one video, Dr. Marks suggests that there is no harm to fertility, although he actually did not have data to back up the claims. Let's take a look at that video.
Pregnant or breastfeeding women can certainly receive a COVID-19 vaccine and should discuss the potential benefits and risks of vaccination with their healthcare provider. There's currently no evidence that any vaccines, including COVID-19 vaccines, cause fertility problems in either men or women. If you're pregnant or breastfeeding, or might become pregnant in the future, the CDC recommends getting vaccinated.
At the time he made that video, he knew that there were reports that the vaccine affected menstruation cycles of women. In another video, Dr. Marks talks about reporting of side effects and says there's a mechanism in place to report injuries. He claims the benefits outweigh the, quote, known and potential risks, unquote. Let's take a look. In another vaccine promotion video, Dr. Marks advocates giving the EUA vaccine to children as young as 6 months. No COVID-19 vaccine had been approved for children that young, and the vaccine had not yet been tested on that population. Let's take a look at that video.
In FDA's analysis for both the Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccines, the immune response to the vaccines in each age group of children was comparable to the immune response of the older participants. The immune responses showed the vaccines were effective in preventing COVID-19. The FDA's evaluation and analysis of the effectiveness data of these vaccines was rigorous and comprehensive. For the Moderna vaccine, we evaluated data for multiple pediatric age groups. For each age group, FDA evaluated effectiveness data based on randomized, placebo-controlled studies in which the immune response of children in each age group following 2 doses of the Moderna vaccine was compared to the immune response of adults aged 18 through 25 who received 2 higher doses of the vaccine in a previous similar study, which determined the vaccine to be effective in preventing COVID-19. For the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine, the effectiveness data to support the EUA in children 6 months through 4 years of age are based on a comparison of immune responses following 3 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine to the immune responses among individuals 16 through 25 years of age who received 2 higher doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine in a previous study which determined the vaccine to be effective in preventing COVID-19. Please talk to your child's healthcare provider about any questions you have.
Dr. Gruber's full testimony is being entered into the record, but I'm going to share part of it with you now. So I asked Dr. Gruber, so you had given them a September 15th date, which you considered to be, I think, very aggressive compared to prior timelines for other vaccines. Is that correct? Dr. Gruber said that is correct. And who was pushing you to move that date up? It was Dr. Marks. You said that in your email there are very important regulatory issues that need to be settled. And as an example, you mentioned a pediatric plan. Can you explain what that means and what needed to be settled? Why was the BLA approval dependent on the pediatric plan? Because it required by law that a vaccine manufacturer will assess the vaccine further in the pediatric population if they have not been tested as part of the efficacy study. As I recall, in the efficacy trial, there were adolescents and children, I think, down to 12 years of age, but the vaccine was not tested in children less than 12 years of age as part of this efficacy study. So a vaccine manufacturer then has to put a document together describing, even though the vaccine was ready for approval in an older population or the adult population, that it would conduct further studies to evaluate the safety and effectiveness of the product in pediatric subjects. So that's the Pediatric Research Equity Act, PREA, that is a law that vaccine manufacturers and by implication FDA has to comply with. So we had to review the documents that Pfizer submitted delineating the type of subjects they would be conducting in pediatric studies they would be conducting in pediatric subjects. And that, of course, and this is what I stated in my email, was important because safety in younger populations is even more paramount than in older populations. I then asked her, you mentioned that the pediatric plan was becoming increasingly complex. What was complex and how did the FDA and your team adapt to those complexities? Dr. Gruber said, so by definition, pediatric subjects go until age 17, including age 17. And as we discussed earlier on this morning, we had become aware of data suggesting a risk of myocarditis. And this data became apparent because the vaccine was rolled out and the EUA. And of course, there were post-EUA surveillance systems in place by the CDC and the FDA. And they showed it was for myocarditis and pericarditis in younger adults, but also adolescents, young males, and 12 to 17-year-olds includes the pediatric population. So we had to discuss with the sponsor, that was Pfizer in this case, given that identified risk, what further studies did need to be conducted if we were to license the product in the post-marketing space to further assess that risk. And this is referred to as a post-marketing required studies. I asked her, And that is complex in a way different from prior vaccine approvals? Dr. Gruber replied. The difference was that we became aware of this risk of myocarditis. If there would not have been this information and this data, there would not have been a need to require Pfizer to conduct post-marketing required study to further evaluate the safety signal as the regulations prescribe. And so we also had to review proposed protocols for that further post-marketing required study. And that also comes with, they have to give us a date when they're going to initiate this trial, when they're going to conclude these studies. So this is where review activities were ongoing at that time. And I asked her, and that's part of the timeline that Dr. Marks was asking you to compress. Dr. Gruber said, yes. Studies, did their trials, were they geared to test whether the vaccine prevented transmission?
No, they were not.
Does the EUA, when you issue an EUA, is it also accompanied, or as part of that production, a list of things that the vaccine manufacturer can or can't say about what their vaccine does or its efficacy?
In general, that's the case both for EUA and for BLA, where the FDA not only regulates whether the product can be given to the public or made available to the public, but also regulates what statements can be made. And it's in the fact sheet for an EUA or the package insert for a licensed product that the claims that the FDA has vetted and agrees are correct need to be listed. And in fact, if a company makes an advertisement claiming something that has not been shown to be correct by the FDA's review, then they're breaking the rules.
They're breaking the laws, too.
The law, yes.
Yes. Sometimes we make a distinction here because laws are written by Congress and rules are made
Fair enough.
by the regulators sometimes. Did the FDA production ever say that the manufacturer was permitted to say that it reduces spread?
No, that was not part of the FDA review or the fact sheet.
Did you see in the media that there were at least politicians making that claim?
I did see that in the media, yes.
I'd like to show a video that Pfizer produced. This was an ad for, I believe it's for the boosters, maybe.
You know that unwelcome guest everyone wishes would just leave already? That's COVID-19. That's why I got the new updated booster, designed to help protect against recent Omicron variants. Got it?
Okay, that's good. Given that they weren't, this was an EUA product, is there anything missing from this ad? Does that seem like a compliant ad to you?
Well, normally advertisements of products include some disclaimers, of course, in places you go for more information or a suggestion that one talk with one's physician and so forth. So it does seem like something is missing here.
I'm going to ask you, Mr. Siri, was the FDA, not Dr. Krause, but was Dr. Marks aware of this video? And isn't his, not within Dr. Krause's subdivision, but within a subdivision under Peter Marks, aren't they responsible for policing these things? And did Dr. Marks know about this ad?
Absolutely. Our firm sent a letter to the FDA about this advertisement and others, including on Sesame Street, pointing out that they do not comply with the federal regulations and the federal law because even the EUA itself issued for the Pfizer COVID vaccine said that any time the EUA product was going to be promoted, there was a disclaimer that must be put on it saying, this has not been licensed as safe and effective. But nonetheless, that disclaimer, you do not see it on that advertisement. And when we pointed out to the FDA, they did not do anything about it. Even worse, the CDC itself actually violated the rule by promoting the vaccine as safe and effective when it was EUA. And we wrote a letter to the FDA saying, are you going to enforce your rules against the CDC? And the FDA never took action.
It would be inaccurate, sir, to say that you quit your job at the FDA after 30 years and you were the top guy, or actually the deputy director, and you quit because of the process that led to the speedy rollout of the vaccine. It would be inappropriate for a member of Congress to insinuate that, would it not? Because actually, after 30 distinguished years in that role of deputy director, that was during a time when a new director was being sought, and your hat was in the ring, but unfortunately, you got passed over for it, and you left after that. That's the reason why you...
No, that's not true. There was no hat and there was no search. Dr. Gruber and I resigned on essentially the same day.
And Dr. Caslow became the director.
That was more than a year later, yes.
And you didn't have anything to do with the approval process of the vaccine.
Well, no, I did contribute to that. So let's be clear. So the
Final
original authorization under EUA...
The final approval took place months after you left the job, correct?
No, that's not true either. Maybe I can just refresh you on the chronology.
I stand corrected.
The gentleman from Georgia's time is expired, but the witness may provide an answer.
So the emergency use authorizations occurred in December 2020, and this was an all-hands-on-deck effort, and I made major contributions to the policy and the review work and everything that happened at the FDA that brought the vaccines to us.
Thank you.
We then also had the question about the licensure of the vaccine, in particular of the Pfizer vaccine, and that occurred in August of 2021. And I was still at the FDA at that point, and that was the episode that Mr. Massey was talking about. I left the FDA in November of 2021 after, at the end of August, at the end of September, no, it was the end of August, telling my supervisor that I was leaving.
Let's let the witness answer. The time has expired. Let's let him answer.
But you didn't leave because of the way that the vaccine was rolled out, the certification and approval, correct?
The things that were happening at the FDA at the time did, in fact, influence me to leave at the time that I did.
Mr. Siri, would you agree that the biggest reason for vaccine hesitancy is because of what the United States government told us about COVID and about the vaccine itself?
Absolutely. I would absolutely agree with that. I think that when you listen to a lot of the statements made about vaccines, when you express benefits that clearly don't exist, that are easily disproven, that causes vaccine hesitancy. When you say over and over it can stop transmission, when the actual studies show it doesn't. Right. The studies by the CDC themselves, when they found more nasopharynx in the vaccinated, viral carriage in the vaccinated, in their nasopharynx versus the unvaccinated, and more rates, please.
Totally agree. Dr. Vaughn, would you agree?
I agree. I think, again, they were told one thing, and then most people, once the opposite happens, usually start to question whoever told them that.
Exactly. They told us it wasn't with the lab. They told us all kinds of things that weren't true about where this thing came from in the lab. And then maybe the biggest one, first virus in human history where there's no natural immunity. Is that true, Dr. Vaughn? Is there natural immunity for this virus like every other virus?
I will tell you, again, I was early in actually having basically an immunoassay that would tell me among all my patients who had COVID, and there's about 7,000 people that I had that database on. And up until Omicron, the reinfection rate among my people that were seropositive was basically zero.
Dr. Krause, you've been involved in this approval. Considering knowing this lack of liability, how the processes are adjusted at the FDA process to reflect, and it seems like it should be more scrutiny and much more accountability and responsibility the government should have.
Well, so the FDA doesn't interface directly with the PrEP Act or the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, and yet I think it is clear that the vaccines that induce the passage of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program needed this kind of protection. There were lawsuits, and yet these are vaccines that were safe and effective and were viewed as, and still are viewed as, a public good. And these are among the vaccines that Dr. Pavia says.
But you, as knowing, you were looking and reviewing some vaccines, including during the pandemic, right? You're a doctor, you were reviewing some of them, and and seeing what is good, what is bad for these approvals, right? Emergency approvals, even in the COVID vaccine in this case. Did you adjust your processes based on understanding there is blanket immunity? Do you do something differently, or do you take that in consideration?
So when the FDA reviews these vaccines, there's a statutory standard that the vaccines have to meet of safety and efficacy. And that standard is different under an EUA as it is under a BLA, and yet the FDA has to show that these vaccines meet that standard. And that's the standard then that vaccines that are eligible
but if
for the
something
Vaccine
goes
Injury
wrong and
Compensation Act-
companies, was anything done differently during the COVID-19 pandemic, and was it since done differently? And if something goes wrong, there is any accountability? If they didn't provide information, what is the accountability really for the companies?
Well, obviously the PrEP Act provided the companies with a shield from this kind of accountability, and yet the FDA still had the authority to look at the data.
And these are two very different standards. For example, the Pfizer trials stated that there is a 2-year follow-up period, yet the emergency use authorizations for children were granted in as little as 7 months. Our children.
Oh, I completely agree that the trial relied upon to license COVID-19 vaccine was anemic, meaning no matter how much delay, how much they sped it up, the problem is there's not enough data in that trial. Only 2 months of placebo control on average information to compare is not enough time to actually assess the safety of that product, in my opinion. And you can see that by looking at drug trials, what they do in those trials. You'll have years of placebo control safety review.
Well, and I want to cover that a little bit. In the chart you provided in your written testimony shows safety follow-up still under a year, and this is for the trial for age groups for 16 and up and 18 and up. Yeah. So there seems to be even less review of the vaccines that impact our children. And you also note that the COVID vaccine trials were, as you say, anemic when compared to drug trials. Mr. Siri, why are vaccines reviewed under the biologics process versus the drug reviews as you described in your written testimony?
That's an FDA decision to do that. I mean, technically, vaccines could qualify as drugs as well, but they are dealt within CBER, and that's an FDA choice.
Well, is there a higher standard of review or more meticulous review for drugs versus the biologics?
In practice, that's what's occurred. Pursuant to the regulations, I don't see why there should be, frankly. It's just a matter of practice, and I think it's a product of the way that the regulators themselves view these products versus drug products. They, in many ways, view themselves as partners with the companies making them. When you watch Peter Marks's video, he very much sees himself as having a hand in saving everybody. He views himself as saving everybody. He wants to, this product is part of what he wants to push out. Unlike drug products, it's not the same relationship.
Sounds like he has a bit of a God complex.
I heard comments earlier about, they believe passionately in vaccines, and they were speaking about folks who take issue with vaccines, but I would say some of the most fervent people who are passionate about vaccines are those who support these products, will support them without even looking at some of the primary data, and will easily dismiss the primary sources that do show very serious concerns.
Can you respond to that statement for the American public so that we may avoid the spread of even more misinformation?
Thank you for that question. It's a deliberate misinformation. The CDC receives reports from states based on the medical examiner's review. The medical examiners determined that these deaths were more likely than not due to COVID. So that number of 1,700, it's actually 1,696 if you look on their website, is reasonably accurate as a minimum. We know that just for MIS-C, which is a complication which children suffer about a month out, that there were about 7,000 documented cases and 179 deaths due to MIS-C. So children did die. 1,700 may not be much compared to 1.1 million adults, but how many children can die and it's an acceptable number?
Can you talk specifically about why that population was affected by the vaccine so adversely? And do we have any idea what, boys going through puberty all the way to probably young men in their 20s, how they've been affected by this and how their hearts have been affected.
So myocarditis occurred most predominantly in the various studies in young men, as you say, age 16 and 17, but there were increased rates higher in men than in women, going up also to much older ages, although not as high as the youngest. So I don't know if it's necessarily a puberty issue because this also affected people as they got older, but that was where we saw it most frequently. And the rates of myocarditis in these young men was quite high. In the early studies, it appeared to be around 1 in 5,000 vaccinees. We still don't understand why that was the case. What we luckily found was that most of these cases were mild, and yet there were some cases that were not mild. And of course, there were also some cases where, many cases where if one's diagnosed with myocarditis, of course, that changes a young man's life because he'll probably then avoid being in sports and will still have some continued medical follow-up. So we don't understand it. It's most common after the second dose of vaccine. We found, luckily, that it did not appear to be as frequent as children got younger, and it also did not appear to occur with anywhere near as high a frequency with third and subsequent doses of vaccine. But it is a real finding that is associated with the vaccine. Luckily, in most people, when they get it, not severe, but certainly was enough to give us pause when we were evaluating the vaccine.
Mr. Krause, I want to ask, is natural immunity real?
Absolutely.
And is it also, does natural immunity exist if you've been exposed to COVID?
Exposed to but not infected?
Well, infected.
Yes, so people who've been previously infected with COVID or who've previously had the COVID-19 disease were shown in a number of very good studies to have reduced incidence of subsequent COVID. And in fact, the protection of a previous episode of COVID was greater than the protection that was received from 2 doses of vaccine. It turned out that if you had both had COVID and vaccine, then you were protected even a little bit better. But there is no doubt that a previous episode of COVID induces immunity that is protective.
So it's not some conspiracy?
No, it's not a conspiracy.
I think this is an example of where the government denies this, and we even have members on this dais who deny it, and that's what reduces trust, I think, when there's a known fact of 200 years, and it's being denied in the context of a new disease, but it's actually applicable in the new disease. That's another thing that breaks the trust between health institutions and the public.
You raise the concern that flexibility in the EUA standard and lack of transparency regarding its application create opportunities for political interference, right?
Correct, yes.
Okay, then later you say, and I guess maybe this because a pandemic is an emergency situation, in a pandemic, it is essential for there to be flexibility to allow availability of life-saving products, even if they do not meet the standard for licensure. So I want to give you a chance to guide me through.
Thank you so much for that question, Mr. Ivey. So what we found in the pandemic was that the criteria that were used to license, no, rather to even authorize the initial vaccines in December of 2020 were very rigorous. And the public deserved that those vaccines be looked at using very rigorous criteria. And that's why the public had confidence in the vaccines then. And this was true whether people were Republicans or Democrats. The trouble is that there also were other times when the EUA was used, for example, the hydroxychloroquine that you mentioned, when in fact the standard was much, much lower. And yet if the public says this is an EUA and that's an EUA, they don't understand the difference.
Right.
And that's why I'm advocating that although you can't take and shouldn't take the EUA away, one does need to provide a better explanation of what an individual EUA actually means.
If you have all your kids go to school for 2.5 days a week for social distancing, but then you send all the kids to the same football practice 5 days a week, does that kind of defeat the purpose of the social distancing at school?
I think if you're getting at the fact that social distancing was inconsistently applied, I think that it's certainly not difficult to come up with examples where more versus lower risks would have been taken.
Does COVID spread higher before or after 11 p.m.?
I have no knowledge
Okay.
of that.
So closing a bar down at 11 p.m. instead of 1 a.m. Does COVID spread more at a grocery store than a hardware store?
Grocery versus hardware, I'm not aware of that.
Okay. And the reason I say this is when we talk about vaccine hesitancy and we talk about trust at our institutions, these were rules that were put in place that any common sense, normal human being would look at and say, this doesn't make any sense.
Is anybody aware of whether COVID is more contagious at a church than a strip club? Does anybody want to take a shot at that? The reason I ask is our governor shut down churches on Easter but left the strip clubs open. I don't think there was any science behind that decision. There may be other things driving it, but it certainly wasn't science.
Representative Massey, I
yes,
think
Dr. Vaughn.
at the end of my testimony, the problem with following the science is that it's not a leader, it's a meanderer. And you will come to all kinds of conclusions if the science is guiding, but the leader is basically not having any accountability for how stupid his decision might be. And instead, it's leaders that make decisions, and they have to be informed by the science, but they also have to balance it against other benefits or risks.
Dr. Vaughn, I want to ask you a question. You said you treat long COVID and you treat vaccine injuries, and you've seen the same sort of things you think a lot of it's caused from the spike protein, which you described. Has the government made it easier or harder to differentiate between those two conditions? Or haven't they confounded this issue by putting the data together and making no effort to distinguish between long COVID and a vaccine side effect?
I would say a lot of the people that I see, I mean, I do a very robust inventory, mainly because I want to collect the data. And so I had to add to a lot of the long COVID questionnaires, did you receive the vaccine? Did you have any side effects from the vaccine? And did the vaccine make your symptoms better or worse? And I think that's an important discussion, but I will say there's plenty of people that fill out my list and say, the vaccine is what caused my symptoms. The day I got the vaccine, that's when I had the symptoms that I have. Now, they've had COVID since, but I do think disambiguating all of that is a very important thing because I think it's an important distinction.
Do you have any recommendations for Congress in ways to ensure that the vaccine injured receive appropriate care and compensation?
Yeah, the simplest way would just be to remove the immunity to the companies that make those products. It's now been many years that these products have been on the market. Everybody here is saying they're safe. A lot of the folks I've listened today say they're safe. Then there should be no reason to continue giving those companies the immunity to liability for injuries if they are safe, as has been advocated here today. Behind me is a representative from a group called React 19. This one group has over 36,000 seriously injured Americans from COVID-19 vaccine. It is run by two individuals. One was a clinical trial participant in the AstraZeneca. One received the Moderna vaccine. He was an orthopedic surgeon, had transverse myelitis. There are hundreds of medical professionals that are part of this group. They're a very serious organization. And people always tell me, the folks who call your firm about vaccine injuries, they're anti-vaxxers. No, I assure you they're not, because the folks who have issues with vaccines don't get vaccines. They don't call us about vaccine injuries. It's only after they get injured they get gaslit in that way. These folks deserve our attention and our sympathy. Every person who's injured by a disease, whether it's COVID or any of the other diseases mentioned today, we should care about them. We should take care of them. We should care about every child injured by any infectious disease, like the doctor here treats. But we should also care about those injured by vaccine products, and we don't. The CICP, we currently have a lawsuit. We have two lawsuits pending right now seeking to asking a federal judge to declare the CICP program and the PrEP Act immunity unconstitutional because, to your point, that program has zero due process. You don't know who your trier fact is. There's no opportunity for hearing. You don't know anything. It's basically a black hole. And they only have, and this is another thing Congress could potentially address, they only have a few $1 million. So even if they were not constitutionally process deficient, they don't have any money to pay anybody.
Dr. Pavia, are you a member of the Infectious Disease Society of America?
I am.
Are you an active member?
I believe so.
Were you a fellow in 2020?
A fellow is an honorary level, yes, I was.
Were you a board member at one point?
That was a number of years ago.
Are you aware that they've taken monies in 2020 from AstraZeneca and from Pfizer?
So to my knowledge, when IDSA takes money, it's only into their foundation, which is separate from the society itself. And the foundation uses that money for educational activities.
So I'm going to submit for the record the documents that show that. All right. Mr. Siri, can you tell us about Maddie DeGury? Was she a participant in one of these trials? And how was her case reported?
Maddie DeGury, who we represent, her and her family, was one of only about 1,100 children in the Pfizer 12 to 15-year-old COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials. Pointed out earlier, you need to have a separate trial for children. When Pfizer after her second dose, she suffered a serious injury. She was in the emergency room. She had a cascading adverse reaction. She ended up in a wheelchair with a feeding tube. And the fact that the vaccine caused an injury, it happened. It's tragic, but injuries from products happen. But here, the real incredible part of this story is that when Pfizer reported her injury, they reported it as functional abdominal pain. We know that from a FOIA production that we had to fight to get. We then told the FDA in 4 separate letters, hey, Pfizer did not fully inform you about Maddie DeGury's injury. She's in a wheelchair. She has a feeding tube. The only thing they told you is she has functional abdominal pain. She has a tummy ache. After 4 letters, over 120 days later, they finally responded. And what did the FDA say? They told her to file a VAERS report. She was in the clinical trial, a VAERS, which, by the way, she had already done months earlier. We then sued the FDA for all their communications regarding Maddie DeGury in the Southern District of Ohio, federal court. And when we finally got those documents, here's what we found. The FDA did finally ask Pfizer about Maddie DeGury, but it was only after somebody who's very, very wealthy emailed Janet Woodcock about Maddie DeGury. She then asked Dr. Peter Marks, and then Peter Marks asks that request be sent to Pfizer. Pfizer responds, and this is the first time, as far as we are aware, that Pfizer ever tells the FDA about Maddie DeGury's injuries. And when you read the narrative that was provided to the yes.
What was the response to the FDA of Peter Marks when he found out that they had misled them?
He seemed unconcerned. And my understanding is, he said, well, they reported she had a serious stomach ache. So, they reported that she had a serious injury. It was basically a whitewash. He sat, as I would expect, as a partner with Pfizer, defending them from their misconduct. He should have been outraged. He should have said, why didn't you report this? Irrespective of whether you thought it was related, you had an obligation to tell us of all injuries. We decide later what to do with the data, but you got to report it. They didn't report it. I'm not aware of any penalty, any issue with Pfizer about it. And when you read the internal email chain, which is part, by the way, in the document we submitted, we have a link to all those emails. You can read them yourself. Pfizer's paid principal investigator says he doesn't, quote, feel, that's what he writes, that the vaccine caused the issue. And it appears that Mark's just accepted
Whether the vaccine caused the issue or not, can you throw somebody out of a trial and not say what happened to them?
It corrupts the entire process. The idea is that you have a new product, you don't know how it affects the human body, so you take in all harms that occur after vaccination, you report all of them. The causality assessment happens afterwards, potentially, but you bring them all in, and it should, as I pointed out earlier, be a statistical comparison. Here, basically, from what you look, if you look at the email chain, it looks like Mark just goes, oh, Pfizer's paid principal investigator says he doesn't feel it's related. And that goes kind of in the chain of emails, and it looks like that's how it dies. No reprimand to Pfizer, takes no issue with them, as far as I can tell.
So my final question, have you heard any misinformation here today that you want to clear up?
I've heard a number of things that I would characterize as misinformation here today. For example, I stated that I did not see any case report of a child with no comorbidities dying of COVID vaccine. And I believe that then that was misrepresented as I'm saying there's never been a child. And then the response was, well, there are death certificates showing that children died of COVID vaccine. Well, you know what? If we're going to accept death certificates as proof of a cause of death, there are a lot of death certificates that say that COVID-19 vaccine caused deaths. We get them all the time at our firm.
So I think I heard the implication that we mandated vaccine for children. To my knowledge, there was no group of people outside of the military. Nobody under 18 was mandated to get the vaccine. Many mistakes were made with school closure policies. I'd be the first to talk about that, and we've published on ways to keep schools open safely. You know, Mr. Siri's a skilled litigator. He's a better arguer, and he's more eloquent than I am. But many of the things that he said are just patently not correct. They are what an advocate carefully puts together to represent his clients, which I fully respect. But science doesn't look at one side or the other. It tries to play straight up the middle.
1 minute. Correct the record.
There's no doubt that vaccines cause side effects. And a lot of people got COVID vaccines. And of course, when you give these vaccines to an entire population, many things happen to those populations, and it's hard to know which of these things are due to the vaccine and which are not. The vaccine safety system is actually a lot more complicated than what Mr. Siri said. It's not just a question of VAERS and other systems for collecting anecdotal reports, but what happens then is once those anecdotal reports come in, if it looks like there might be something that's happening, this is looked at in more detail in large databases that allow for a controlled look at what happened in people who received vaccine and didn't receive vaccine. And it's indeed these kinds of databases that allow us to find a side effect like myocarditis, which is much rarer than the vaccine safety system would have been able to pick up before. And so the vaccine safety system is robust. It does find things. But it's going to take time to figure out for all of these things which of these side effects are due to the vaccine and which aren't. And in the end, it still comes down to benefit and risk. And I would argue that there was very strong benefit with at least the primary series of the COVID vaccines, and for many people of the boosters, especially in the elderly and the immunocompromised. One can argue about the benefit of some of the COVID vaccines in some people, and including some of the additional boosters, but overall, the work that was done to bring the COVID vaccine to the American public was in fact life-saving.
Dr. Krause, did you take a booster?
I did not.
Okay, Mr. Siri, you were addressed. I want to give you 5 seconds to respond.
5 seconds. There are absolutely mandates for children. I know because we got an injunction against the San Diego School District for requiring the COVID vaccine, as well as all the school districts in California. And then in terms of the post-licensure safety systems, yes, there's the vaccine safety data link. There are other ones, and we address those in the document that we provided Congress. Those have serious issues as well, and I'll stand on my papers. Thank you.
Without objection.